How would you define Black identity in the context of today's diverse, interconnected world?
Well, there are about somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.4 billion ways to define Black identity.
When it comes to Black Muslims, American Black Muslims. So, how do you see that this shapes their experiences, not only historically, but currently
Well,
as
it
well?
depends on what part of when we're talking about Nation of Islam, Black Muslims, the Fruit of Islam, Black Muslims, the Five Percenters that sort of delve into Islam. But in this current environment, in this current climate of Islamophobia, of anti-Black racism, and all these other isms that are rearing their ugly head at most major universities, Black Islam in the United States going back to slavery
Mhm.
that acknowledges that that despite slavery and despite the horrors of slavery, that many folks, many enslaved Africans retain their Islam.
Hello and welcome to the Muslim Viewpoint, a new video podcast series powered by the nonprofit national media platform American Muslim Today. I'm your host, Maya Gayler. Today we are joined by Donald Earl Collins, an accomplished author and professor of academia. His work focuses on African American identity, race, multiculturalism, and education reform. All right, yes. So, welcome to the show, Donald. I'd love to start us off by asking about you. So, in your writing and work, you often discuss the complexities of Black identity. How would you define Black identity in the context of today's diverse, interconnected world?
Well, there are about somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.4 billion ways to define Black identity if you include the entirety of the Black and African diaspora. Folks who are African and Black who live in Africa, folks who are Black and of African descent who live in the United States, who live in Brazil, who live in the Caribbean and Latin America, South America, and Central America, and India, and other parts of South Asia, and other parts of the Middle East, and Northern Africa, and Europe as well. Point is, there's just too many ways to have a singular definition. But in the American context, I would simply say is it's a culture and of folks who have a heritage that partly comes from Africa. However, broken up it might have been through the trauma of slavery, combined with elements that have contributed to what we now consider Americana, American society, and so on and so forth, with bits and pieces of European and Amerindian or indigenous culture kind of mixed in with that. So it's a mesh of things. It's not just one singular thing. So there's no one singular way to be Black. There's no one singular way to express Blackness. There's no one singular way to express Black culture. So that's kind of what I mean when I say what it means to be Black, right? That's broad, but that's it.
Yeah, so in the context of today, there is a lot in the news about Trump's attack on the diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. You have commented on this and putting it in contrast to President Johnson's push for, quote, on ramps to an otherwise uneven playing field in his 1965 commencement speech. So, this regression, as you have put it, 60 years worth of anti discrimination protections in the federal workforce, this regression is alarming. So, in your opinion, what message does President Trump send by overturning these
Well, there are two
programs?
messages, really. One is the one I talk about in the article with Al Jazeera from last month, which is clearly that part of what folks have been seeking, including Trump over the last 60 years, but especially in the last 5, is a return to the days where there weren't any of these sorts of programs around to try to give on ramps to folks who've been marginalized, particularly Black folk, right? So if you take away those ramps, you have a situation where more folks, presumably folks of color, but also folks who are just marginalized in general, have less opportunities for higher education. They have less opportunities to get contracts with the federal government. They have less opportunities to get jobs that are worthy of their education, experience, accomplishments, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, you get to a place where the only people who really have advantages and will have even more advantages as a result would be white people, especially white men, right? That's one piece of it. But the other piece, and it's a piece that we, the media, have not really talked a lot about, is this seething jealousy that really is part of the agenda of the right, of Trump and his Trumpists and other folks who follow in his footsteps. That is to say that they don't want to compete with Black excellence. They don't want to compete with Latinx excellence. They don't want to compete with Arab Muslim excellence. They don't want to compete with the excellence of white women. They don't want to be in competition with people who actually might be twice as good, 5 times as good, 10 times as good as they are at their jobs, as good at being students, as good at being thinkers and intellectuals, and so on. So that's the other part that's part of this whole recent attack, right? You know, affirmative action's been had been on attack for like 60 years before it was overturned in 2023. But this DEI thing is more about Trump, you know, the competition that excellence from these marginalized groups brings to the fore when they are allowed to be on the playing field. That's what this is really about.
Yeah, and so, you touched on Black identity, and as we know, there are many ways to identify this. Um, but we want to highlight specifically the intersection of race and religion when it comes to Black Muslims, American Black Muslims. So, how do you see that this shapes their experiences, not only historically, but currently
Well,
as
it
well?
depends on what part of the. I mean, we're talking about Nation of Islam, Black Muslims, the Fruit of Islam, Black Muslims, the 5%ers that sort of delve into Islam. Are we talking about Black Muslims who are mainstream Muslims? I mean, they're like 4 or 5 different kinds of Black Muslims. But if we're talking about the biggest group, which is the Nation of Islam, then in some respects, this is a self-fulfilling prophecy for them. Whether you're talking about Elijah Muhammad or Louis Farrakhan or you're talking about Malcolm X, all of them have this bent toward American society doesn't really want to integrate Black people, right? And so if they don't want to integrate us, why are we trying to fight for something that they don't want us to have anyway? So maybe the best thing for us is to remain separate, to build our own communities up, to build up businesses, to build up educational infrastructures and other things so that we're not dependent on the larger American society for anything. Now, how much of this is poppycock and balderdash? I don't know. I mean, the whole scheme of things. But Trump's and Trump and the MAGAs and their sort of trying to bring back segregation in some way, shape, or form actually justifies a lot of their argument around why Black folk in this country need to remain separate from larger white institutions, because in the end, you might get shafted as a result of all of this. So I think that reflects a certain strain. But it also is true for Black Americans who aren't Muslim, too. There's a survey that Washington Post did about a year ago showing that about 1 in 3 African Americans thought that integration was a mistake, right? That is to say that, you know, desegregating public schools and desegregating higher education institutions and desegregating employment and other things put Black folks at a disadvantage, meaning that the only folks who could really benefit were folks who already had higher education, who already were lower middle class or actually middle class or somewhat affluent. Those are people who did tend to benefit the most from these sorts of programs, not people who live with poverty, not people who are generally in the working class, you know, like lower working class, borderline on poverty. So there's a strain of this that basically rings true in the sense that, well, what do you expect? This is what white people do, kind of thing, right? So I think that's what we're talking about here from certain segments of Nation of Islam and certain segments of Black folk in the United States in general.
Yeah, and so you've written quite a bit for the publication Al Jazeera, and you even posed the question of whether or not the repression on college campuses um, and restrictions on freedom of speech during their protest is might be in the new era of McCarthyism. So, can you expand on this and the implications it might have on the academic integrity of these universities where this happened, students protest, they were met with police force and the danger that it possesses.
Well, be put it perfectly honestly, we're in the era where we have the corporate university. The connections between universities and capitalism have pretty much existed since capitalism's been around. But there's a difference between having an institution that's trying to raise money and get donors to and alumni to bring money in for the athletic programs or to build a building here and building there. When we have a situation with universities having every time a new president for a university or chancellor for a university comes in, they launch a massive capital campaign to raise $500 million, $1 billion, $2, et cetera, to the point where now you have universities sitting on $50 billion endowments like Harvard, $3 billion endowments like University of Pittsburgh, and other places. And you also have the situation where you're bringing in people at the upper echelons of an academic institution who are presidents, who are um, associate provosts and provosts and so on, who really only have a background in business. So they run the universities like a business. And like any business, you don't want people outside your business protesting. Regardless of what they're protesting, they could be protesting about whether janitors should be using mops or Roombas, right? Versus protesting about genocide in Gaza, right, at the hands of Israel and U.S. weapons. And it wouldn't matter. As far as these leaders of universities are concerned, these are all black eyes and they're handled all the same way. We need to repress this. We need to punish the students and the faculty and staff who join them in these protests. We need to get this stuff off of campus. We need to call it anything other than what it is, a legitimate protest. And so that's the danger of this in the sense of McCarthy, is that stuff that is about serious human rights violations, serious human rights kinds of issues gets twisted into, oh, this is anti Semitic. Well, last I checked, Palestinians are Semitic. So what do you mean by anti Semitism? Unless that's just a catchword for saying white European Jews who live in Israel, which is not exactly the same thing, right? So, and that's what the McCarthy era did too. It twisted protest, in terms of segregating the armed forces and, stop banning certain books and turned it into you're anti-American, you're pro-USSR, you're pro-communist, and all this other stuff. And they painted everyone with the same broad brush, and it meant that a lot of people ended up losing their jobs, not getting the education that they were entitled to, being in prison, being blacklisted in their profession for years and years and years, and so on. And that's been happening now in the U.S. in the last year and a half, 2 years, as a result of the protests over Gaza and the protests over other things. Folks have lost their jobs. Folks have not gotten their contracts renewed, including yours truly. And well, my situation with Loyola University of Maryland and so on. People have been suspended. Students have been expelled and arrested. I mean, think about this. You're going to school to get an education, liberal arts education, where a significant part of that is critical thinking and the ability to challenge things on the basis of free thought and being able to have the evidence to challenge stuff. And then you bring in the police and to beat up people and put them in jail. And that's very much like the McCarthy era. That's the Red Scare. I'm not sure what color scheme you'd use for this scare, but it's not the Red Scare anymore. But it's similar to that in a lot of respects.
Yeah, and kind of going from that, we've seen this rise of activism on behalf of Palestinians within the Muslim community and even within the Jewish community and just the larger activist community. I mean, we've seen overlap of, Black Lives Matter groups standing up for Palestinian justice. So, can you, tell us your thoughts on this, intersection, this overlap of these movements coming together and making this more global movement and voice?
Sure. The simple truth is, and this is with pretty much any sort of movement, right? Is that if one of us isn't free, then none of us are free, right? So if there's genocide going on in Palestine at the hands of Israeli Defense Force and other forces, and the U.S. Providing arms for those sorts of things, then you protest it. But to understand that that is very much related to what's happening on campuses across the country in the U.S. while protesting at the same time. But it's also very much related to U.S. support for the UAE, United Arab Emirates, and their sort of land grab in places like um, Sudan and in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And that's related to the treatment of Rohingya in Myanmar and Bangladesh. And that's related to the treatment of Uyghurs, in Northwest China. That's related to the climate change that the whole world is expressing. Then yes, you can bring coalitions together around all of these sorts of things in terms of protest, because it's more than just about 2.3 million people or however many people remain in Gaza. It's not just about Palestine. It's not just about the Middle East. It's about the whole world. And it's about how people are being marginalized all over this world, while fascism and the far right marches through a lot of so-called advanced countries in the world at this point in time. And so, yes, this is very much a coalition of folks who understand that this is not about whether you read the Quran or not, whether you understand the difference between the Torah and the Talmud or not, whether or not you actually are evangelical Christian or not. It's about the reality that regardless of what you believe, we're all human. And we all have the right to exist. We all have the right to eat. We all have the right to live our lives to the fullest. And when that is being curtailed in some way, shape, or form, we need to join in and fight all the stuff that's happening as a result.
Yeah, and kind of going back to the broader Black History Month, um, often Black History Month is used to commemorate historical figures, which is always great. However, do you think, or do you have any um, ideas on how to shift the focus from a more historical aspect to a more contemporary aspect? As we've touched on, there are still issues that the Black community faces today.
Well, I'm going to take a little bit of umbrage with the last part of what you said, which is the Black community,
Mhm.
because I don't. Saying the Black community makes it sound like there are 47 million people who live in one community in the
Right,
United
right.
States, which is ridiculous, right? We live in lots of communities,
Mhm.
right? But Black folk do have a fairly, particularly American Black folks
Mhm.
born in the United States whose ancestry traced back to slavery in the United States do have a certain background and knowledge of what the history of the country is supposed to be. But the bigger problem with Black History Month, besides it becoming a political football pretty much every time a Republican takes office, right? Besides that obvious thing, right? Is the fact that when we talk about a Harriet Tubman or Ida B. Wells or Ida B. Wells Barnett when she was married, or W.B. Du Bois or Booker T. Washington, whomever, is that we just leave them there in the history and the ether of history as, oh, these were great people who did great things way back when. The end. And as a historian, particularly as a historian that tries to talk about contemporary and bring the historical in the contemporary, it does them a disservice, right? Many of the things and the themes that they talked about, wrote about, did art about, protested about, fought for, et cetera, as part of the tapestry that is Black history. Not only as a part of the larger overall American history, it's stuff that we're still dealing with now. The racism hasn't gone away, obviously, right? Not in a systemic fashion, not in an institutional level, not among individuals. So it's a responsibility, not just of historians, but really anybody who knows anything about Black history to say, This is why Du Bois is important. This is why Harriet Tubman's important. This is why Ida B. Wells is important. This is why these folks are important. They speak to the things that we're dealing with right now, whether it's police lethality, whether it's voting rights, whether it's on ramps to higher education being cut off, DEI as basically a code word for we want Black people not to have the same opportunities as white people have, kind of things. These are things that they fought for. And so this is why their work is important now, right? And I don't think that as a country that we do a very good job of bringing these folks from way back when, which is really not that long ago, into the present.
Yeah, and I think this might be a good time to hear your thoughts about the culture wars, which you have written about, and that's this battle of ideology and beliefs and opinions that kind of happens, within the political parties or just within our society as a whole. Um, and specifically how this impacts our education, as we have seen in DEI and Republicans and politicians trying to ban books from schools and change curriculums. So, in your view, how can schools foster a more inclusive understanding of our American history? What can really be done at the point that we're at?
Well, at the point that we're at right now, not a whole heck of a lot. Just to answer your question in short, not much. If states and local school districts are saying we are not going to have you do books about queer life, about queer moms, about transgender folk, about Black folk and what they experienced growing up, it's hard to get around that unless you're going to foment or formulate a movement where teachers basically bring these things into the curriculum as a form of protest. Short of that, there isn't a whole lot that teachers can do. Their communities can do things about that, right? Libraries, despite all of it, are fighting tooth and nail around these sort of book bans. And so what a lot of libraries are doing, they're having little festivals about, let's do a banned book festival, all the books that you're trying to ban in school. We're going to have it opened up so you can read them here. We're going to open it up so the authors can come here and talk about these books that they should have been talking about to your kids at school, but you can do it at the library. So it's about really what communities can do to fight this at the local level, at the county level, at state levels, to fight these sorts of things. But if you're asking specifically about what public school teachers can do in an environment where they have almost no autonomy in terms of what they teach because they're constantly teaching the test, where they can lose their jobs if they teach out of these books, or because it might stack of critical race theory or intersectionality or any of these other terms that folks think are forms of public indoctrination of kids kinds of things. There isn't a lot that you can do inside a public school specifically about curricula that you're supposed to teach because it's the law that you teach it this way and you can't teach it another way without getting in trouble. But you can do stuff outside of school hours. You can do stuff in terms of other public institutions within these communities, particularly with libraries. That's why public libraries are incredibly important. That's why even though they've been a battleground for these things, legislatures have lost the battle with public libraries because they're libraries. It's a very different category than public schools. And people fight tooth and nail for libraries in ways that they don't fight for their own public schools. So.
Yeah, and kind of shifting back to the media, education, and Black Muslims specifically, as someone who has been a writer and in the academic sector, in your opinion, how can the media specifically, but also universities as well, better support and better represent Black Muslims?
Well, for one thing, to start with, to recognize that there's such a thing as people who are Black who also practice Islam. That would be a great start, right? Like, I'm serious about this. When I think about the way the different universities I've taught at over the years, when I think about my colleagues who've taught at different universities, some of whom are actually Black Muslims, whether it's Nation of Islam Muslim or like they're more traditional in terms of Islam, right? there's just this singular belief because, just throw out any word, right? Say someone's Muslim. The first folk that universities think about are Arab Muslims. That's who they think about. Not 40% of the continent of Africa practices Islam. The continent, not just Northern Africa, all of Africa, like the entire African continent, 54 countries, 40% of the folks who live there practice Islam, period, right? But no, there's this general sense that Black people believe in this sort of like very emotional form of Christianity, and that's that. So the very first step is to acknowledge that these people exist. Right? If you can do that, then you can do a whole lot of other things to make the campus more welcoming for them. But in this current environment, in this current climate of Islamophobia, of anti-Black racism, and all these other isms that are, rearing their ugly head at most major universities, just being able to even get that word out is going to be hard. Let alone, let's make a curriculum up that actually acknowledges the history of Black Islam in the United States going back to slavery. That acknowledges that that despite slavery and despite the horrors of slavery, that many enslaved Africans retain their Islam, at least portions of it, and even brought it into their Christianity when they became Christians during slavery. So that there's always been a strain of Black Muslim life among Black folk in the United States, right? That the Nation of Islam doesn't just come out of nowhere. It doesn't just go, oh, I finally got my hands on the Quran, let's start Islam now, right? The Nation of Islam, by the way, I think is exactly a century old this year, right? Wow. So, 1925 or so. So it's been 100 years. Yep. And you mean to tell me it's only now that only in the last 100 years that Black folk figured out, oh, there's this other religion, Islam. No, this has been a strain of this throughout Black history among Black folk. So just getting them to acknowledge that and acknowledge the basics of that history, let alone trying to create a campus climate for these folk so that they feel as welcome as any other folks should feel on a university site. That's going to take a lot of work. So.
Yeah, and just a final question to you. So, what do you hope that your work brings to the table, especially now today, and what do you hope that people take away from it?
Well, there are two things. One, I try to be honest about where we are as a people, as a human species right now. Where are we in 2025? How did we get to where we are in 2025? What are the roots to why things are happening the way they're happening? And so that's why I talk about racism, systemic racism so much. That's why I talk about Islamophobia so much. It's why I talk about narcissism so much, right? It's why I talk about capitalism so much, because these big forces, these big themes, these big things that have basically run through our lives and have ruined a lot of lives are why the world is the way it is today. Why we broke the 1.5 Celsius barrier in terms of global warming and climate change last year, and why that's probably extremely deadly and dangerous, and we need to do something about it, quick, fast, and in a hurry, right? Those kinds of things. That's why I write about the things I write about here and now. But I also write about these things for posterity, for a future that is not dominated by such issues, such isms, such imperialism and militarism and settler colonialism and all these other things that are deadly to whole classes of people. We need to get over this thing known as white supremacist racism and capitalism and all the other ills that basically help reinforce it. If we don't, we're not going to have a future, at least not a future that we want, right? Certainly. And that includes folks who benefit the most from white supremacist racism. They're not going to have the future they want either. So it'd be better if they just gave up, but they're not going to. This is why we have to fight. So.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you again, Mr. Collins, for joining us today. That's all I have for you. Thank you for joining me on Muslim Viewpoint. If you value our public service journalism, please support American Muslim Today, a 501c3 nonprofit, by following us on social media at American Muslim Today, or donating at AmericanMuslimToday.com. Before you go, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Until next time, I'm Maya Gayler.